Good evening. I hope you've had a great day today. Welcome to BVJ's Bedtime Stories. I'm Big Voice Jay, and this is a show where we get you ready for a good night's sleep with public domain short stories just for you. Links to all the stories can be found at the show notes at bedtimewithbvj.com. And if you'd like to support the show, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link on every page and post. Tonight we continue our story, The Naval Treaty, by Arthur Conan Doyle. I was able to at last persuade my companion to take my advice, though I knew from his excited manner that there was not much hope of sleep for him. Indeed, his mood was infectious, for I lay tossing half the night myself, brooding over this strange problem and inventing 100 theories, each of which was more impossible than the last. Why had Holmes remained at Woking? Why had he asked Miss Harrison to remain in the sick room all day? Why had he been so careful not to inform the people of Briarbrae that he intended to remain near them? I cudgeled my brain until I fell asleep in the endeavor to find some explanation which would cover all these facts. It was 7 o'clock when I awoke, and I set off at once for Phelps's room, to find him haggard and spent after a sleepless night. His first question was whether Holmes had arrived yet. "He'll be here when he promised," said I, "and not an instant sooner or later." And my words were true, for shortly after 8, a hansom dashed up to the door, and our friend got out of it. Standing in the window, we saw that his left hand was swathed in a bandage, and that his face was very grim and pale. He entered the house, but it was some little time before he came upstairs. "He looks like a beaten man," cried Phelps. I was forced to confess that he was right. "After all," said I, "the clue of the matter lies probably here in town." Phelps gave a groan. "I don't know how it is," said he, "but I had hoped for so much from his return. But surely his hand was not tied up like that yesterday. What can be the matter?" "You are not wounded, Holmes?" I asked as my friend entered the room. "Tut, it is only a scratch through my own clumsiness," he answered, nodding his good mornings to us. "This case of yours, Mr. Phelps, is certainly one of the darkest which I have ever investigated." "I feared that you would find it beyond you. It has been a most remarkable experience." "That bandage tells of adventure," said I. "Won't you tell us what has happened?" "After breakfast, my dear Watson. Remember, I've breathed 30 miles of Surrey air this morning. I suppose that there has been no answer from my cabman advertisement? Well, we cannot expect to score every time." The table was all laid, and just as I was about to ring, Mrs. Hudson entered with the tea and the coffee. A few minutes later, she brought in 3 covers, and we all drew up to the table. Holmes ravenous, I curious, and Phelps in the gloomiest state of depression. "Mrs. Hudson has risen to the occasion," said Holmes, uncovering a dish of curried chicken. "Her cuisine is a little limited, but she has as good an idea of breakfast as a Scotchwoman." "What have you here, Watson?" "Ham and eggs," I answered. "Good. What are you going to take, Mr. Phelps? Curried fowl, or eggs, or will you help yourself?" "Thank you. I can eat nothing," said Phelps. "Oh, come, try the dish before you." "Thank you, I would really rather not." "Well, then," said Holmes with a mischievous twinkle, "I suppose that you have no objection to helping me." Phelps raised the cover, and as he did so, he uttered a scream, and sat there staring with a face as white as the plate upon which he looked. Across the center of it was lying a little cylinder of blue-gray paper. He caught it up, devoured it with his eyes, and then danced madly about the room, passing it to his bosom and shrieking out in his delight. Then he fell back into an armchair, so limp and exhausted with his own emotions that we had to pour brandy down his throat to keep him from fainting. "There, there," said Holmes, soothing, patting him on the shoulder. "It was too bad to spring it on you like this, but Watson here will tell you that I never can resist a touch of the dramatic." Phelps seized his hand and kissed it. "God bless you," he cried. "You have saved my honor." "Well, my own was at stake, you know," said Holmes. "I assure you it is just as hateful to me to fail in a case as it can be to you to blunder over a commission." Phelps thrust away the precious document into the innermost pocket of his coat. "I have not the heart to interrupt your breakfast any further, and yet I am dying to know how you got it and where it was." Sherlock Holmes swallowed a cup of coffee and turned his attention to the ham and eggs. Then he rose, lit his pipe, and settled himself down into his chair. "I'll tell you what I did first, and how I came to do it afterwards," said he. "After leaving you at the station, I went for a charming walk through some admirable Surrey scenery to a pretty little village called Ripley, where I had my tea at an inn and took the precaution of filling my flask and of putting a paper of sandwiches in my pocket. There I remained until evening, where I set off for Woking again, and found myself in the high road outside Briarbrae just after sunset. Well, I waited until the road was clear. It is never a very frequented one at any time, I fancy, and then I clambered over the fence into the grounds." "Surely the gate was open," ejaculated Phelps. "Yes, but I have a particular taste in these matters. I chose the place where the 3 fir trees stand, and behind their screen I got over without the least chance of anyone in the house being able to see me. I crouched down among the bushes on the other side, and crawled from one to the other, witness the disreputable state of my trouser knees, until I had reached the clump of rhododendrons just opposite to your bedroom window. There I squatted down and awaited developments. The blind was not down in your room, and I could see Miss Harrison sitting there reading by the table. It was 10:15 when she closed her book, fastened the shutters, and retired. I heard her shut the door and felt quite sure that she had turned the key in the lock." "The key?" ejaculated Phelps. "Yes, I had given Miss Harrison instructions to lock the door on the outside and take the key with her when she went to bed. She carried out every one of my injunctions to the letter, and certainly without her cooperation you would not have that paper in your coat pocket. She departed then, and the lights went out, and I was left squatting in the rhododendron bush. The night was fine, but still it was a very wary vigil. Of course it has the sort of excitement about it that the sportsman feels when he lies beside the watercourse and waits for the big game. It was very long, though, almost as long, Watson, as when you and I waited in that deadly room when we looked into the little problem of the speckled band. There was a church clock down at Woking which struck the quarters, and I thought more than once that it had stopped. At last, however, about 2 in the morning, I suddenly heard the gentle sound of a bolt being pushed back and the creaking of a key. A moment later, the servants' door was opened, and Mr. Joseph Harrison stepped out into the moonlight. "Joseph!" ejaculated Phelps. He was bareheaded, but he had a black coat thrown over his shoulder so that he could conceal his face in an instant, should there be any alarm. He walked on tiptoe under the shadow of the wall, and when he reached the window, he worked a long-bladed knife through the sash and pushed back the catch. Then he flung open the window, and putting his knife through the crack in the shutters, he thrust the bar up and swung them open. From where I lay, I had a perfect view of the inside of the room and of every one of his movements. He lit the 2 candles which stood upon the mantelpiece, and then he proceeded to turn back the corner of the carpet in the neighborhood of the door. Presently he stopped and picked out a square piece of board, such as is usually left to enable plumbers to get at all the joints of the gas pipes. This one covered, as a matter of fact, the T-joint, which gives off the pipe which supplies the kitchen underneath. Out of this hiding place, he drew that little cylinder of paper, pushed down the board, rearranged the carpet, blew out the candles, and walked straight into my arms as I stood waiting for him outside the window. Well, he has rather more viciousness than I gave him credit for, has Master Joseph. He flew at me with his knife, and I had to grasp him twice and got a cut over the knuckles before I had the upper hand of him. He looked murder out of the only eye he could see with when we had finished, but he listened to reason and gave up the papers. Having got them, I let my man go, but I wired full particulars to Forbes this morning. If he's quick enough to catch his bird, well and good. But if, as I shrewdly suspect, he finds the nest empty before he gets there, why, all the better for the government. I fancy that Lord Holdhurst for one, and Mr. Percy Phelps for another, would very much rather that the affair never got as far as a police court. "My God," gasped our client. "Do you tell me that during these long 10 weeks of agony, the stolen papers were within the very room with me all the time?" So it was. "And Joseph, a villain and a thief!" I am afraid Joseph's character is a rather deeper and more dangerous one than one might judge from his appearance. From what I've heard from him this morning, I gather that he is lost heavily in dabbling with stocks, and that he's ready to do anything on earth to better his fortunes. Being an absolutely selfish man, when a chance presented itself, he did not allow either his sister's happiness or your reputation to hold his hand. Percy Phelps sat back in his chair. "My head whirls," said he. "Your words have dazed me." "The principal difficulty in your case," remarked Holmes, in his didactic fashion, "lay in the fact of there being too much evidence. What was vital was overlaid and hidden by what was irrelevant. Of all the facts which were presented to us, we had to pick just those which we deemed to be essential, and then piece them together in their order so as to reconstruct this very remarkable chain of events. I had already begun to suspect Joseph from the fact that you had intended to travel home with him that night, and that therefore it was a likely enough thing that he should call for you, knowing the Foreign Office well, upon his way. When I heard that someone had been so anxious to get into the bedroom, in which no one but Joseph could have concealed anything, you told us in your narrative how you had turned Joseph out when you arrived with the doctor, my suspicions all changed to certainties, especially as the attempt was made on the first night upon which the nurse was absent, showing that the intruder was well acquainted with the ways of the house. How blind I have been! The facts of the case, as far as I've worked them out, are these. This Joseph Harrison entered the office through the Charles Street door, and knowing his way, he walked straight into your room the instant after you left it. Finding no one there, he promptly rang the bell, and at the instant he did so, his eyes caught the paper upon the table. A glance showed him that chance had put it in his way, a state document of immense value, and in an instant he had thrust it into his pocket and was gone. A few minutes elapsed, as you remember, before the sleepy commissionaire drew your attention to the bell, and those were just enough to give the thief time to make his escape. He made his way to Woking by the first train, and having examined his booty and assured himself that it was really of immense value, he had concealed it in what he thought was a very safe place, with the intention of taking it out again in a day or two and carrying it to the French embassy or wherever he thought that a long price was to be had. Then came your sudden return. He, without a moment's warning, was bundled out of his room, and from that time onward there were always at least two of you there to prevent him from regaining his treasure. The situation to him must have been a maddening one, but at last he thought he saw his chance. He tried to steal in, but was baffled by your wakefulness. You remember that you did not take your usual draught that night. I remember. I fancy that he had taken steps to make that draught efficacious, and that he quite relied upon your being unconscious. Of course, I understood that he would repeat the attempt whenever it could be done with safety. Your leaving the room gave him the chance he wanted. I kept Miss Harrison in it all day so that he might not anticipate us. Then, having given him the idea that the coast was clear, I kept guard as I have described. I already knew that the papers were probably in the room, but I had no desire to rip up all the planking and skirting in search of them. I let him take them, therefore, from the hiding place, and so saved myself an infinity of trouble. Is there any other point which I can make clear? Why did he try the window on the first occasion, I asked, when he might have entered by the door? In reaching the door, he would have to pass 7 bedrooms. On the other hand, he could get out onto the lawn with ease. Anything else? You do not think, asked Phelps, that he had any murderous intention? The knife was only meant as a tool. It may be so, answered Holmes, shrugging his shoulders. I can only say for certain that Mr. Joseph Harrison is a gentleman to whose mercy I should be extremely unwilling to trust. We are always on the hunt for great stories like these to feature on the show. You can send your suggestions to bigvoicej@gmail.com. We've got a YouTube channel full of stories from the show. Go to tiny.cc/BVJ Bedtime. If you found some value in our storytelling tonight, don't forget to show the love. There's a Buy Me a Coffee link on every post. Thank you so much for listening. Good night.
Diamond Club hopes you have enjoyed this program.